Thank you, Lynn. And thank you all for sticking it out on a Friday afternoon, especially with all the Black Friday sales just outside the door. I want to provide you with a snapshot of the advantages and challenges of working in a large immigrant-receiving urban center. Toronto is a major destination for many immigrants. It's very dynamic as the demographics and the needs of newcomers are constantly changing and settlement responses are constantly adapting. Toronto is the largest city in Canada with a population of just over 2,700,000, and the Greater Toronto area is about 5 million people. And it receives a disproportionate share of immigrants, disproportionate in terms of its, it basically brings in about 30% of all immigrants to Canada. If you look at these stats, in 2016, the MTV is Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. And I'm just picking up on the graphs that Tim showed you. And in 2016, those three cities received 56% of immigrants to Canada, and Toronto's share was about just under 30%. Going back 15 years prior, in 2001, the share of those three cities was almost 3/4 of all immigrants, 73%, with Toronto taking 4 in 10. So what we're seeing is a trend away from the major cities, a trend that, is a good trend if we see diversity as part of Canada's identity. Otherwise, that diversity only exists in these three large centers. The benefits of working in a large urban center like Toronto are that it's really a well-resourced city with many agencies, many specializations, a diverse social cultural supports. OCASI is the umbrella organization for settlement agencies in Ontario, and its member agencies in Toronto alone, there are 142 member agencies, settlement agencies in Toronto. And they are multi-service, multicultural, they specialize ethnically, they specialize by language, and you can see on that list from the Afghan Women's Center to the Vietnamese Association, Jamaican Association, and so on. Many organizations that provide services to their communities. And some of those services target, have a focus that target women or refugees or people with disabilities, and some specialize their focus on need, such as employment, legal clinics, mental health clinics, even specializations such as the Center for Victims of Torture, and so on. So this is a huge benefit to those of us working in the field, because then we have these kinds of supports, and it's a greater benefit, of course, to the newcomers. And so it provides a real advantage to an organization like mine to be able to refer newcomers to specialized services. But this isn't necessarily the reason why newcomers choose Toronto as a destination. A StatsCan study showed that the main reasons that people chose Toronto were that they had family or friends there, almost 50%. Half of that number went to Toronto because of job prospects. Otherwise, what we're looking at are, the supports of family, the social and cultural supports, the ties to a known community that are so important. In addition to the fact that perhaps there are family and friends there are literally hundreds of ethnic associations and social clubs that basically these communities organize themselves for cultural retention. The Italian community that I'm more familiar with alone has 85 social clubs. And these are clubs that are based on, towns, the Palermo Social Club, the Catania Social Club, and so on. I'm a member of the Mamola Social Club because Mamola is my hometown in southern Italy, Calabria. And, so I know that on the first Sunday of every September, we have a big festival, a picnic where, hundreds of people from my hometown gather. And we gather to honor our patron saint. This is the feast day of our patron saint. And so we start the day with a mass. We then have a procession, and then we have a huge picnic where we share food, and we connect with paisans. We connect with each other and find out what, the relatives and friends are doing back home. On Monday, we go back to our jobs as accountants, bricklayers, homemakers, and teachers. We're proud Canadians, but it's important for us to connect with our cultural roots. Large urban centers provide that capacity to newcomers. However, there are challenges in working in a large urban center. It's a magnet for immigration, and that creates a dynamism that, is constantly changing and even has turmoil as part of it. And, we have had mass migrations of people coming at once. So for example, the Kosovars, 5,000 that arrived in a matter of weeks. Canada airlifted them out of Kosovo. And so it was our responsibility at Costi to find interpreters because they were staying at military bases. And fortunately, again, this is, large urban center. We found many Albanian-speaking interpreters, and we provided that. But we, found that what was happening was that many of the interpreters were giving the wrong message to the Kosovars. They were saying, you need to go back because you're playing into the ethnic cleansing hands of the Serbians. That's why you're here. Well, these people didn't need that kind of pressure, so we had to deal with that. So these are the kinds of things when you have massive migration like that. With the Syrians, we learned to dance to resettle 2,000 of them in 3 months. Again, great resource in that there's a large Arabic-speaking community that we could draw on, and in addition, the involvement of the community at large, the institutional community, and we made it work. Now we're having difficulty with the Yazidi refugees in that it's difficult to find Kurmanji-speaking interpreters. The refugee claimants, a whole other issue in that we're dealing with community backlash with refugee claimants and sensationalistic media. But these are challenges that are manageable. It's part of the dynamic nature of our work. What is really a transformative challenge for us now is, and I mean transformative in that it's fundamentally going to change how we do things, it is the issue of the lack of affordable housing for the refugees that we're looking after in Toronto. To give you an example, rental costs aside and vacancy levels and so on and so forth, here's our direct experience. With the government-assisted refugees 4 years ago, we were moving them out of temporary housing into their own homes in a matter of 2 to 3 weeks. With the Syrian refugees 2 years ago, it took us, even though we had a massive group that we had to find housing for, it took us 5.5 weeks to move them into their own homes. Today, with the refugee claimants, it's taken us 4.5 months, even though we've added housing workers and so on. The cost of housing and the lack of affordable housing in Toronto is a serious problem. So what we now have is really an opportunity that has arisen. And this is where the needs of smaller communities are intersecting with the challenges we're having in Toronto. In that we have smaller communities that are actually reaching out to us saying, send them here. We need newcomers to fill jobs. And we've learned something through the Syrian Refugee Initiative in that you can see it as a pilot. Because there were so many Syrian refugees that arrived, the federal government added additional receiving centers in smaller communities. So the two examples that I'm more familiar with are Leamington, Ontario, which is a small farming community in southwestern Ontario, and Peterborough. And both of those communities set up reception centers for the Syrian refugees. And 2 years later, those refugees are still there. There's about 400 refugees, I understand, in each of those communities. And the reason is because of that critical mass that, it was all Syrians that went there, and they had the mutual support. And we have examples where families ended up in rural areas and they were alone and moved to Toronto. But when you put, again, it's the issue that I was talking about earlier, the need for the social supports and the cultural supports. So it's working. And so now we've piloted with the refugee claimants directly from Laval, Quebec, where 5 families agreed to move to Chatham-Kent. Chatham-Kent was the one that reached out to us and said, we'll take some of the refugee claimants. So there's 5 families there now. They're still there, and we're working with them. Now, a really interesting opportunity has come up, which has shifted the way we do our work, and it's we got a call from a private employment recruiter from Moncton, New Brunswick, and said, we've got hundreds of jobs down here, and we could use some of these refugee claimants to take these jobs. So we set up a session in the hotels with him and the refugee claimants, and he came up and he did his pitch. 21 of them agreed that they would move to Moncton. They didn't have their work permits, so we said, okay, let's wait and see. Once you get your work permits, you'll move down. By the time they got their work permits, they had moved out of the hotels into their own homes, and now they weren't as interested in moving again. So this gets even more interesting because the employment recruiter, we explained this to him, and he said, I've talked to the employers about this, and they're saying, let's see if there are others who move to Moncton. We will pay for their rent. We'll bring them down here before they get their work permit. We'll pay for their rent until they get their work permit. Then we'll give them a job, and they can start paying rent. And we'll give the transportation as a loan. And if they stay in the job for a year, we'll forgive that loan as a bonus. So, this is something that is evolving that goes to show, how the needs drive change in a sense. We have the same opportunity now in Thunder Bay. The economic development director for the city called us up. They've got 1,200 jobs that are vacant, from mining to the university to Bombardier manufacturing and so on. Good jobs. And so we're going to try the same thing with them. So it's a new model to us, but I understand Quebec is already doing this, and so we're learning from them. But it's a win-win-win in the sense that it's a win for the refugee claimants, a win for the small communities, and a win for Toronto because they're basically staying in hotels. So in conclusion, I think the 3 things that I've learned from this are that, as I said, need drives change. The communities and employers are willing to take refugee claimants whose future is uncertain because they can't fill the job vacancies. The second conclusion is that the kind of shift we are seeing from traditional to non-traditional communities is fundamentally about our Canadian identity as a diverse multicultural society and should be encouraged if we are to live up to that ideal. And finally, we need to pay attention to the social cultural needs of newcomers if we wish to retain we wish to retain them in non-traditional communities, that is, cluster them and they will stay. Thank you very much for your attention.